Good morning. Happy Wednesday. I have Neuro Coffee in hand and it is perfect. Okay, well, today is Wednesday. That means that tomorrow's Thursday, which means 6 a.m. tomorrow morning. Coffee and Coaches Conference call as usual. Always a great group, always great questions, and I'm having so much fun with these. We go a couple of hours and we get a lot done in that time. So please join us. Time is short today, so we're going to dig into today's Q&A. This is actually a discussion that came off of one of the Coffee and Coaches calls. It started off as a discussion about a hinge, and then it evolved into how we superimpose internal rotation on external rotation, how we're actually moving through spaces, not straight planes. Straight plane thinking is kind of like being a little bit of a flat earther. It's probably useful as a demonstration. If you were looking at a flat map of the world, you can say that, okay, this is a representation of the world, but it's not reality. Straight planes are kind of like that. It's like maybe they're useful for discussion, but the reality is that we don't move in those planes. And so hopefully you get a little bit of that out of this discussion. We talked a little bit about squat, a little bit about hinge, how we constrain movement through intentional constraints, or the superimposition of load that reduces our ER space to produce IR. So lots of good stuff in this discussion. So I think you'll find it useful. If you would like to participate in a 15-minute consultation, please go to askbillhartman@gmail.com, askbillhartman@gmail.com, and put 15-minute consultation in the subject line so I don't delete it, and we'll arrange that at our mutual convenience. Have an outstanding Wednesday. I will see you tomorrow morning, 6 a.m., Coffee and Coaches conference call. Have a great day.
I was still a little confused over the discussion we had on Monday about the hinge. And I was wondering if you could walk through at least the theoretical aspect of how we go from IR to ER during the hinge motion. I tried watching your hinge video again, and I'm still, I don't know, I'm frustrated because I'm not getting it. And so here we are.
If you have full relative motions.
Yes.
Okay, full, and so we have to have that representation, and then we have to have something that's happening in a loaded circumstance. They're not the same. You understand that, right?
Yes. So, but I wanted to get the starting point first before.
Yeah. No,
wait.
I just want you to understand that there's going to be a difference coming, right? Right. So as the hip moves through an excursion on a straight line, okay. So traditional imaginary sagittal plane hip flexion. As the limb moves through space in that imaginary plane, the representations will be of external rotation in the early phase through the middle range. It will be an IR representation, and then into the end range, it would be an ER representation. And this is due to the shape change that takes place in the limb position and the pelvic shape. Do you understand that part?
Could you go into that a little bit more?
I can. I actually have fake pelvis. You understand that, right?
Yeah, like I get it from the broad standpoint, but
okay,
details would be
so
great.
In this early range, if I have full relative motion, and I'm constricting the limb to a straight line. Okay, right. So we got to talk about this line right there. This is, and it doesn't exist. Okay, I'm constraining the limb as I move it through space. So I'm putting it in a specific space, right? So as I move through space, this early phase is going to be external rotation because the shape of the pelvis determines that. Okay. So the relationship, the shape of the pelvis, as I am in this position down here, if I have full relative motions, it would be external rotation. You follow me so far?
Now, aren't we nutating to start the hinge?
So as I stand like this, I will be biased towards nutation, and I'm just talking about normal hip flexion. I'm not talking about the hinge. I'm not talking about a deadlift. I'm talking about hip range of motion.
Okay. All right.
Okay. As I move into that space right there, if I have full relative motions, I will get a shape change in the pelvis that produces an ER representation. Okay. Okay. Counter nutation, ER phenomenon. Okay. As I move through this middle range, the pelvis changed shape and it goes back towards the IR representation. So this is notation IR of the ilium. Okay. Got it? Okay. As I go into an end range, if I can do that, I get an ER representation again, where the spine's going to turn towards the leg, and then I'm going to get the counter nutation ER representation again. Okay. That's full relative motion, and that's constraining the limb to an imaginary straight line.
Right. So,
okay. Like if you're doing a table test,
right,
and somebody had full relative motion, that's what it would look like.
Right.
Okay. If I'm standing, right, and for whatever reason, so if I put heavy weights in your hands and you're standing, I immediately constrain the degree of external rotation that will be available. So it gets smaller. So it's less of a representation of external rotation, because when I put heavy things, the muscles on the outside of your body squeeze you and they take away the relative motion. Do you understand that? Okay, so what happens is that this external rotation that you had in this early phase isn't there anymore. It's gone. It's out that way. So it gets smaller. So for me to capture an ER representation, I have to orient the hip outward. So these are the people that when they try to squat, they can't keep their knee straight ahead. They got to go out to the side. Okay, so the ER space is now over there. Okay, it's out that way, because the compression around the body doesn't allow the shape change. So you have to have expansion front to back to be able to put your limb in front of you in external rotation. You follow?
Yes.
Okay. So if we were pulling a weight off the floor, okay, and I have to break the weight off the floor, so I have to overcome the inertia of a heavy load, you can't do that with external rotation. You have to have internal rotation available to you, right? Because that's the downward force that I push the floor away to lift the weight up. Well, if I'm lifting a heavy weight and I'm creating a compressive strategy on the outside of my body that takes away relative motions, then I know that I don't have external rotation over there. For me to have internal rotation, I have to superimpose it on a position of external rotation, which would be over there. So people will separate their feet, or they'll push their knees apart, right, to create an ER moment so they can push down into the floor into IR. You follow me so far?
I do, but
okay, so the position allows me to access external rotation, and then I push the force into the ground to produce internal rotation. So the demonstration of ER is my starting position, and then everything during the lift is going to be an internal rotation applied into the ground in an externally rotated orientation, so I have a space to move in. Okay, if I don't have, think about this for a sec, if I don't have external rotation, I can't produce enough internal rotation force to lift the weight up. So that's one of the reasons why, you know, you can't pick up everything, because you can't produce enough pressure, enough force, because they don't have enough space to start. Okay. So it's not always like you're going through this excursion of ER, IR, ER. That's why people that are talking about that are absolutely wrong. They don't understand how it works. Okay.
What about?
Now, go ahead.
So, you know, when we talk about ER, IR to ER, like in the case of a squat, we're usually focusing on the lowering portion, whereas the lifting portion, we don't really talk about, because basically all IR. Just
okay, hang on. Right? It's not always all IR. It depends on the context. So in like an unloaded squat, you just reverse gears and you go back through the same sequence. When you're lifting something heavy, okay, the IR is magnified in its representation, because I have to keep putting pressure into the ground. The only way I can do that is with internal rotation. I can't lift heavy things with external rotation, because that's an expansion of space, and that reduces the force output.
So then if you're lowering yourself into a hinge, so you're standing and going into a hinge.
Am I loaded?
Well, first I just wanted to get an unweighted representation first before going weighted. So, are you getting that ER shape change in the pelvis? So, and this is assuming a hinge, you're not toe touching, you're not like rounding your back or anything.
Okay. So right away, so here's what you just did. You constrained the relative motion by the representation of what you're referring to as a hinge. So I immediately take away relative motions, right?
Right.
Okay. So not much ER is going to be apparent. Okay. You have enough because you're moving, but it's going to most likely be an orientation somewhere between the pelvis and the foot to allow that to occur.
I guess my confusion is because when you start a hinge, if you're standing, you have to, your sacrum has to nutate.
That is correct. That's IR.
That is IR. So then I was getting confused with then, is the pelvis still trying to go into that ER representation? Like how are we doing this?
No. So like I said, you'll be orienting at the hip most likely.
Okay.
Or you'll see somebody move their foot, or you see them, you can see the ERs represented. Okay. Yeah. It's just, again, you only need enough external rotation to move through space. It's not maximal. It's just enough to move through space. And then with more weight, do you ever see somebody squat really, really well with 60 kilos, right? They're just doing like a warm up and they got a nice squat, and then they get heavier and heavier. And then the depth starts to get more shallow, or they start to make some other compensatory strategy. Like they start to move their knees out wider, or they have to make foot adjustments and toe out and things like that. So the reason that they're doing that is they're trying to create external rotation space to move into, because they have to produce so much compression and internal rotation to move the weight, but they have to create a space to move into. And that's why you see the compensatory strategies, because the minute you start to put more and more load on someone, they have to squeeze. They get to squeeze tighter, which means they have less relative motion between segments. Okay. And so then they just produce enough motion in the available segments, which would most likely it's going to be like a hip orientation kind of a thing to allow them to move through that space.
Okay.
That's why you can't get caught up in like a two-dimensional representation of what things are, because it's not a two-dimensional representation ever, right? It's 3D in space, and then you got to throw 4D of time on there because it will change as you move through space.
Okay. I'll chew on that a little bit.
Well, so the simple rule is you have to have an ER space to move into, and then if you have to produce force, the representation of internal rotation will be magnified. So if I'm doing a 400-pound deadlift, I can assure you with great confidence the amount of external rotation that I'm demonstrating is minimal. A world-class powerlifter doing a bench press of 700 pounds is barely moving into external rotation, because the more external rotation space you have, the more energy and output it takes to hold a load in that space. And so they want to minimize it. They want ER and IR to be as close to the same as possible, because that's where you produce the highest level of force.
Yeah, and otherwise the bar moves faster.
Well, there you go. So that's exactly right. Right. And so under certain circumstances, we definitely want the bar to move quickly. And then you know that you're moving into a more ER representation. Like, and we talked about this before. It's like when you're dropping under the bar in a clean or a snatch, you are moving through space in external rotation, because if you were in internal rotation, it'd be really slow. Right.
Yes.
But when you catch it, right. So when you start to absorb that weight, your initial response is expansion. And then as the bar loads you, you move from ER to IR like really quick, right? Because you got to dampen the load when you catch it at the bottom of a clean, right?
Mhm.
Right? There's very small space in there for you to move into that you have to slow that weight down. Otherwise, and you've seen this probably a million times in the gym when somebody blows a lift at the bottom of the catch, right? They throw the weight forward, they fall back on their butt, and then everybody looks at them funny, and then they have to start all over.
It's true.
Yeah. So that's somebody that the position that they were in, right? They could not capture the IR position that they needed to position the weight. So to slow it down and to capture the position. If they're too expanded if you're too expanded in one direction, the weight goes, you're going to move in that direction. The weight moves in the opposite direction.